So there's the cult direction for it, or there's just, which is just you use these documents and these religions in order to exert your power as the minister or whatever, the leader over other people, and to orchestrate a tight cult-like synchronous or syncing up of people's will,
Mhm.
and then kind of like directing that will. Or you kind of water it down and water it down and water it down until it's just kind of this building where you go and you have snacks and you sing some songs and you have youth groups and families get together and find babysitters for each other and have clubs and stuff like that.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromous. This is Byrne from Tbilisi, Georgia, welcoming you to another in our Anadromous dialogues. And today we are fortunate to have Benjamin Boyce with us. And some of you may not know who he is. Some of you may know very well who he is. And he is, how should we put it? A witness of the events that occurred during the Evergreen University crisis in 2017, in the spring of 2017 in Washington State.
In the spring of 2017, a series of protests, live-streamed by the students, launched Evergreen into the national eye, setting in stark relief the contentions in higher education between academics focused on classical education and those who center education on social justice. These two camps came to dramatic blows when Bret Weinstein, a professor of evolutionary biology, was protested outside his class by students who accused him of being racist. Their evidence derived from a series of emails he had written to question the methods and suggestions of the college's Equity Council, who had been working hard at the behest of the college president, George Bridges, to redesign the college's function around notions of diversity and equality of outcomes.
And the Evergreen University crisis was essentially a strange sort of prelude to what happened with the George Floyd protests and what's happened since then within society. Very much a precursor. The students kind of came up with their own ideas about the way they felt life should be run in the university. Bret Weinstein, who was a university professor there, kind of took the major hit over that, and essentially they wanted a completely social justice, gender affirming society within the school. And what they did was kind of ramp things up to a level of hysteria. And I'm not making those words up. If you want to know more about the story, I would recommend visiting Benjamin Boyce's channel, just under his name, and checking out the very long series called The Complete Evergreen Story. I think if you watch 5 or 6 of those, they're not that long, not as long as my videos. I think that you'll get a pretty good idea of what I'm talking about. Besides that, Benjamin has gone on to be an interviewer par excellence and has chosen for his conversations topics like political correctness, race, but especially things related to gender, from issues with women all the way down to issues, the trans issues. And he has been known for especially getting people who have desisted or detransitioned on his program and to talk with him. This, of course, made him a bit of a target for people. Not that I think he loses much sleep over that. He is indeed a kind of a calm person who will just let you say all sorts of things and then come back, as you will see in this interview, with his observations or rather probing questions. But I have discovered more than a couple very fascinating people through his conversations on his channel, and I deeply appreciate that. Now, I have a confession to make here. I tried to interview Benjamin to get more of his story, but alas, I ended up talking too much again. Some of you may be disappointed by that. Hey, if you don't like hearing my voice, what are you doing on my channel? And if you know Benjamin, then you know he asks people these kinds of questions all the time and is often quietly sitting there, and then will throw out something like an explosive little remark. Not explosive, but probing, again, is a good word. We'd never talked before, and thus I felt perhaps too much of a need to explain myself. I take responsibility for that. Benjamin, being a skilled interviewer, would then kind of just throw in a little bomb. I gave him permission to do this. Just, if you want to treat it like it's one of your interviews, that's fine too. I did get to something, but you'd be talking and I'd say, blah, 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 freedom. Then he would immediately go like, what do you mean by freedom? So if you think I could answer a question like that in like a couple of minutes, obviously you haven't spent much time on this channel. But if you watch the video, you'll see him ask quite complex questions with just a sentence or two as an interjection, which would then send me off. Thanks, Benjamin. So in a way, he was interviewing me as I was interviewing him. A fascinating little thing. So if you just stop and count who talks more, I talk far more in here. But if you listen to what he's actually asking when he asks a question, you'll see that I was rarely in a position to not answer with something more at length. But again, I will confess, I talk too much. So such is life. But if you like Benjamin's interviews, I think you'll feel at home here. So welcome to the Benjamin Nights. So by the way, you should subscribe to the channel if you like it. Look around if you're new here and look at some of the other videos. Smite like if you appreciate this. Also, you can contribute to the channel through PayPal. There is a link below. And you should go over, if you really haven't spent any time visiting Benjamin's channel, you should really go over there, and there will be a link below. And so many interesting conversations. Maybe everyone doesn't interest you. I guarantee you will find some that really do. Then just start looking through the videos and see what you get. And if you want more than what's on this channel, I have another channel called Georgian Crossroads, where I'm currently running a series on a small town here in Georgia. And I don't mean a small town somewhere between Macon and Athens. I mean Georgia in the Caucasus, between the Lesser Caucasus and the Greater Caucasus. And if you don't know where that is, or where Tbilisi is, the capital, you should go look it up. Meanwhile, I'm itching to talk to Benjamin. Let's go.
I've been looking forward to talking to you for a while. I feel like I know you more than you probably know who I am. So do you know anything about me?
I know that you're in the circle associated with Paul Vanderklay.
Yeah.
And
Although
so
I see myself, they often talk about the little corner. They use that phrase, and I see myself kind of on an edge of it. I'm in it,
Okay.
but not in it at the same time. It's an interesting thing. We just had a meetup in Germany where I was invited, and I finally got to meet Paul physically. I know you've done that, so I got to look up to him because he's a tall guy. And But ironically, there were quite a few really tall, like Dutch and German guys there, and there was this really tall Polish guy. So at one point, I'm like 6 feet tall, and I'm just like looking up at these guys. I'm saying, I think I know how other people feel. People who look up to me a bit. It's just like what a strange sensation, because I hardly ever
Hmm.
have that sensation of looking up to tall people. So because I'm just like normally tall, whatever that means.
Hmm.
But yeah, so that was a very interesting thing we did. We can probably talk about that a bit later. What I was hoping to do was, I know you are the interviewer usually, and I was hoping, because I have had some experience with interviews, and hoping to turn the tables on you a bit, but I also don't want to prevent your interview skills from turning it on me. If there's something you wish to follow that you hear that I've said, feel free to turn the tables. And I thought, well, how are things going there right now? Are you, it's pretty morning-ish for you, isn't it?
It's 11 a.m.
Yeah,
It's a nice foggy day so far. It's
right.
clearing up. Yeah.
So I thought I would ask you a bit about uh, your. I'm a Christian, but I would say my Christian history is pretty unusual. Since I became a Christian in the San Francisco Bay Area during the height of the hippie period in 1970. And I'm old enough I was 15 years old, and I became a Christian through the Jesus people. And it turned out later, I won't go too much into this, but that I was in what turned out to be pretty much the ground zero Jesus people group. And so I had a very interesting perspective. Later, that group turned into a cult, or became cultish, depending on how you define it. But who you married, what kind of work you did. I even had to get my demons cast out of me at one point. So all of that was part of it. Then I managed to get out of that, and I ended up at L'Abri in Switzerland. I don't know if you know anything about that. I know you have a bit of a Christian past, but there was Presbyterian um, a Presbyterian minister named Francis Schaeffer, who ended up in Switzerland after World War II. And in 1955, he started this place in the French Alps called L'Abri, which means the shelter. And people started coming there, and it ended up being a place that was for primarily discussion. And they had quite a few different kinds of people coming there. And that kind of broke me out of the more cultish aspects of my own faith, and gave me, what they did was they did something. They emphasized what they called Jesus being the Lord of all life. And what they meant by that was not some sort of, I don't know, platitudinous thing. They meant that means your brain too. That means art. That means culture. That means science. And not simply to go around pasting the Ten Commandments or crucifixes on everything, but to really dive into it. So one of the people that I really wanted to meet, but unfortunately I just heard his tapes, was a Dutch art historian named Hans Rookmaker, and he made these lectures and stuff. I've put a few on my website, but that really kind of turned me into a different sort of a Christian, that experience. I stayed there for a year, and then I ended up in New York City for 16 years. And my goal in New York City was to understand why things had changed so much in the 1960s, and why things were continuing to change, and why they were changing in a certain way. I actually have a very long series, not as long as the Evergreen series, which we'll mention in a moment, but I have a very long series called How We Got Here, and it ends up with being ridiculously long by the end of it. It's only 13 episodes, but two of the last ones are really long.
What's the thesis?
Yeah, it could be in a sense.
What's the pattern of change?
The pattern is that, okay, well, it has to do with modernism in the sense of modernism, both in science and art, being a pattern of pulling things apart to find answers. And the problem is that by the end of modernism, before you get to postmodernism, there is no, you end up with either, the subatomic world, or you end up with total fragmentation and abstraction in art, or finally minimalism, which is just basically lines, or even conceptual art, which is just like, I thought of a great art project and here's the remnant of it sitting on a wall somewhere in a gallery. And one of the things I was also curious about, because rock music is something that I've studied quite heavily, is that why did we change so much? For instance, why did the 60s present such a change? And I'm old enough, I'm 67, to remember the world before the 60s, the high 60s. And I remember that, I never had any problem understanding any of the language in film noir because I remember those people. They used gambling as a metaphor. They used sports as a metaphor. If you'd come up to someone and say 1958, provided they weren't like a beatnik or something like that, if you'd gone up to one of those people and said, you got to expand your mind, man, you got to take psychedelics, they would have looked at you as if you were clinically insane. What are you talking about? Because it was a more imminent philosophy. And it was, in a sense, there was this whole thing of modernism, and people started to live in this kind of like, trade unions and crime and, the suburbs, but it was all ground level. The faith was also ground level. Christianity was very much on a ground level. The only real thing that I can see from that period, besides the beats, that was heading towards the more ecstatic transformation approach from the 60s onwards, would be the Black gospel music. And some of that is just beautifully transcendent. It focuses out, why is the earth? I mean, it's almost like some of those are like Jordan Peterson's often talking about the meaning of suffering and such, but they put it into song very directly. And it's clear that all of this darkness, all of this earth and stuff can't be the only answer. And in a way, I thought that was much more honest than what was going on in the Protestant churches, which is what I want to talk to you about your own experience. But then I studied very much the evolution, for instance, that the hippies had, I've really gone into detail on hippies, on punks. And then eventually, as I was in New York City, eventually I got to know the people who were making the music and such. I'd go to a place where Allen Ginsberg was talking, or, I had friends who were in Sonic Youth, or, and I would start to see, oh, we're moving, and I would see these patterns.
So the pattern of change is deconstruction? Is that what you're saying? Or
not
rebellion?
Really. I would actually look at the pattern of change being like, and you can see this in the arts. You have a figure who's like a messiah. So in music, it would be like Beethoven. Then you'd have a religious kind of version of it following. This would be Wagner and his emphasis on art being essentially a religion. Then you'd have the prophetic. And the prophetic would be the people who challenge what's going on in the religious nature, and they would be the abstract artists like Schoenberg or Weber or all these people who'd make this extremely difficult music. Eventually you get to the apocalyptic, who would be John Cage or Karl-Heinz Stockhausen in Germany, who are making essentially pure noise, but really what they're doing is making pure philosophy rather than music. Although occasionally they will make music, but it's really much more this apocalyptic thing. The same pattern happens later in jazz. The same pattern happens later in rock music. The same pattern goes throughout the entire modern world, essentially, so that we're now living in the period of noise and that abstraction, so that if you go to a place like Times Square, or if you spend too much time on the internet, things are just coming at you. So, and I think we hit another transformation point. I'm looking at 1965, we'll say, just to give a certain point, to about 2012 or so. as being, right now I'm just calling it the age of transformation. After that, we start wherever we are now, and the truth is no one knows where we are now. We're getting beyond postmodernism. We're beyond something in the noise is starting to settle down. We're not sure we like the look of it at all, because it's nothing like, say, the world of the 20th century, the main point of high modernism in the middle of 20th century. Nor is it at all like the age of transformation. It's not like the hippies or the punks or the grunge. It's not like the new age movement. It's not like, spiritual retreats. It's not like psychedelics. Where we are right now, the things that have happened, especially in the last few years, and the stuff going on with social media is simply not, we don't know. And
the stuff going on with social media? What's
the division
stuff
that it creates, the way it changes human relationships. There's good aspects to it. I'm glad I get to talk to you on social media. That's good. I've made friends that I have fortunately brought. For instance, Paul is now a real friend because I've actually finally met him. Before that, he was a cluster of digital images, a nice cluster, I must admit, but still, the people out there on the other side, I talk about this quite a bit. It's just like, don't think just because you see this doesn't mean you know me, doesn't mean I'm real. You know something, but it's very abstract what we see. Mm-hmm. There's too much mediation between us. Mm-hmm. But I think that I see it with the younger generation, especially Gen Z. They live in this very strange world. All the things that, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of the earlier world, it doesn't mean the same thing at all to them. They no longer live as if rock music was the be all and end all, the way I did, or people who are younger than me to a certain point, up through the older millennials did. They now live in a world where what's more important is this thing. What you're doing with your hands, what you're looking at, your mediation, your media. And so as a result, we're in a different world. But one of the good things that I've noticed coming out of this is Jacques Ellul, in his books on technology, talks, especially in his last book called The Technological Bluff, talks about what he calls that it seems like technology will overwhelm us, but he says, and he can't see a way out of it, but he says the good news is it always leaves cracks of freedom. And we can use those for a while. So right now, I think some of us are using YouTube as a crack of freedom. You can use social media as a crack of freedom. It can also be an enslavement. I think TikTok's more on the enslavement side of the fence. Certain aspects of YouTube.
What's freedom?
What's freedom? Well, these days people would talk about agency and stuff. I would say that it has to do with the ability to make choices and to at least have some sort of ability to not, what can I say? I want to quote, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose, but yeah, that's what happens when you get too much of this stuff in your head. No, I think freedom has to do with, we're not totally free. No one's totally free. You don't choose your eye color. You don't choose your, where you were born. You don't choose your passport. You don't choose your language. You don't choose your family. You don't choose the era you were born into. You don't choose your country. But within all of our unfreedom, there are places of freedom. We can choose. So you and I are relatively free to choose to talk to each other right now. You're also free to right now saying, Byrne's full of bullshit. I go, that's free. It would be not free if, and I think this is what you feel with some of the things that kind of weigh on us all, when people are afraid to talk because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing and getting, canceled or censored or whatever they're afraid of. Mm-hmm. My own feeling about this is, I'm going to say what you want. You can say it to me. If you want to attack me, fine. You don't know me, so I don't really take your attack personally if someone's going to leave a nasty comment.
Hmm.
But I think that in this, I think we're in a new zone where there are really, really bad things, possibilities happening now. Whether it's the war or whatever the hell happened with the pandemic in the last few years, or just the divisions within society. It was interesting. I was in Prague when the Russian troops went over the border, and the people in Prague were immediately, they immediately went 1939, 1968. They saw Hitler coming in. They saw the Russian tanks, and so they were totally against. They wanted to make a statement. Eventually, they got 80,000 people out on the streets while I was there. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and she said, "This is bringing the Europeans together," she said. And then I turned to her and I said, "Yeah, it's not doing the same thing to the Americans. We're still in, this very big sense of division."
Well, with regard to Europeans, that was a flashpoint to formulate some collective solidarity, I'm sure, against the Russian threat. But
Right.
what's happening in Italy and Hungary
exactly.
is a movement towards independence,
Exactly.
which is called fascism, according to
Yes, I've been
what's
following.
the open conspiracy of globalism, where it's a conspiracy if you criticize it, but it's a virtue if you're for it. The way that our news media is castigating this Italian prime minister who has no power over us as fascist or as a hero, kind of shows that Europe isn't completely on board with this unelected bureaucracy of unification.
Right. And I agree with you. I think that what's happening is that as time goes on, in America, it's the ADD that kicks in. But I think here in Europe, it's more of the political divisions keep growing. And when I was talking to Germans, but then again, I was talking to Germans who were, following Paul Vanderklay. So how these people were in a different sort of zone. They were wondering what was going to happen. They weren't taking nearly as right-leaning a perspective, but at the same time, they were all wondering, how long can we go on with this other thing that we've been doing for so long, the European
Union? The Union? Okay.
Yeah, because it's clear that I think part of it is, you probably saw that clip by, what's her name, Giorgia Meloni from Italy, the new was it a president or prime minister? I can't remember.
PM, yeah.
Yeah. Where she talks about losing our humanity. And this was a clip pulled out by people as like evidence of fascism. They were, but it's clear that too much has happened in one sort of way. That is to say, this left-leaning thing, I tend to call it the Hydra, because it pops up with so many different heads, and every time you seem to cut one, it grows again into something else.
Yeah.
But I think that maybe, like I said, I think we're sitting on a zone where there's all these tensions, particularly in the West, but you can also see it, whether it's riots in Sri Lanka or what's going on in Iran right now, or, they're just, or what in the world's going to happen to China. People are wondering, are they financially kind of nearing the end of their growth spurt, and are they going to start retracting, and what does that mean? And meanwhile, and then there's the big question of what in the world's going to happen in America. So, which we don't know. And I think the pressures will grow as we get to election cycles, evidently. So in that is where, for instance, I was just, to get back to churches and such, I was just watching something about Ireland. And I realized in the 1980s, Ireland was still very much predominantly Catholic. And then within a few years, and I'm not sure exactly the reason, I think, the sex scandals with priests but I think the general, but also their economy grew. And so there was more secularism brought in. I mean, prior to that, the people I met in New York City who were coming from Ireland were not, they still had a connection to this older Ireland, which is still there, hidden under the surface now, out in the back counties. But essentially, it's become one of the least religious countries in Europe now, which literally this happened in shockingly short amount of time, just a few years. It was like it went from here, and then all of a sudden it's like over here. And I see something similar happening in America, but of course, America always throws these kinds of predictions off because America's got something else. There's something about the way we approach religion and such, which is certainly different than Europe, And
Mm-hmm.
but I do see this thing that happened between 1967 and say 2012 as being, now I was part of the Jesus movement, which at first seemed like it was bucking against the hippie ideal. But if you look at this whole period as, I think some people are calling it the sacred self now, the rise of the sacred self, the rise of, I am the center of the universe. It's me. You can call it narcissism, or you can call it selfishness, or you can call it many different things. But essentially, we got slotted.
Call it freedom.
Well, it could be. And maybe that's the appeal of it, is freedom. But it's freedom, as Jordan Peterson often points out, without responsibility, which isn't much freedom.
It's property, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yourself is your profile is your property. Your internet footprint is your property, and by that I mean it's something that you get to cultivate.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's your plot of land. That's basically, if you look at one strain of Enlightenment thought, it comes down to property.
Right.
So that would be the sum total of freedom. Would be to manage your own property and to cultivate something.
Yeah.
With that, another form of agency would be to use your property, your digital footprint, to be against something or to be for something, before resistance. In the case of what happened post-Trump, everybody, a large string of people put hashtag resistance, and their property, their cultivation, their freedom, their expression was to take down this fascist regime. And there's a number of different other, pronouns in bio, or the Ukrainian flag in your bio, or all these different signals that show you your property is part of this union of people who are together against a cause or for a cause. So the cause would be the supernominal, or the superior unifying nation state that your property is a part of in a digital way. And then you go on a little bit further than that, and if you happen to be an intellectual, or you happen to have a sense of irony, then you get to tear apart other people's property. You get to tear apart these other nation states, these causes, by producing memes or critical content or long form essay content that then expands your property. Like my property is it's like a fife at this point. I have hundreds of hours of me engaging with other people, expanding, questioning, and being a lot more dynamic than just a flag in my bio or a pronoun in my bio. Like I have this suite, that I've expanded on, which I would think would be my freedom, my property. To what extent I own it, to what extent it could be just completely deleted tomorrow is open, but I always act as though I'm free to do that and to cultivate that.
Right. No, I'm a big proponent of telling people to don't just leave everything in the cloud. Don't leave everything up there. Get some of it at least in, some sort of hard drive if you can. If you're better than that, then there's that stuff. If you can collect books and read, because I do think we will eventually get to a point where we have some kind of cyber warfare. And looking at the Chinese and the Russians, if someone pulls all the stops out, which Paul Vanderklay reminded me was an organ metaphor, which is kind of cool. and it gives you the biggest bass notes and stuff.
Hmm.
That I think we don't know yet. That's the thing. A lot of people are predicting where we're going, and I would say it's more like Leonard Cohen sang in the song "The Future." Things are going to slide in all directions. Won't be
Hmm.
nothing left for the order of the soul. To me,
Hmm.
that seems like the great danger right now is that, or what Bob Dylan said in The Times They Are Changing, don't speak too soon because the wheel's still in spin and there's no telling who that it's naming. And of course, it's no longer naming Bob Dylan himself, which
Hmm.
is the irony of that.
So you
Um,
can have a cause that you link up your internet property or your profile to, and then you get to participate in this discussion, COVID,
mhm,
vaccine, anti-vaccine, or
right.
whatever the cause of the day is, whatever the current thing is. And then you could do something a little bit deeper, which would be of the order of a religious movement or a social movement, like I'm a trad cath, or you begin to
Mhm,
use an identity to plug into a tribe, and something that has a little bit more cultural substance to it. I would think allows for more freedom of movement rather than just a cause, right? And then you have in that domain you would have religion, like I'm Orthodox Greek, and then you get to explore that. And to adopt that and wrestle with that and
mhm,
promote it or demote it in different ways. And that's where I think I would suppose that a cultural movement or religious movement is a little bit more stable in the
mhm,
realm of the profiles and the internet, to sync up people and then to
right.
allow people more freedom of expression. And by freedom of expression, I don't mean just the ability to speak, but content to speak of and to be relevant to an audience through. Right.
Mhm, mhm. So that's how you see your own uh, choice of freedom, your act of freedom, your demonstration of agency.
I'm making this up on the spot in
Right.
relation to what you were talking about with regard to art movements.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
I don't think that kids are just looking at their phones and doing things with their hands. I think they're engaging with society through these things. I think that
Right.
this is just the medium through which
But
all these other
my
movements,
my
rock
point.
and roll,
Oh, by the
hippies, and so
way, evidently, I'm on the cheap version of Zoom. So in 10
on.
minutes, it's going to tell me to stop. But what I'll do is I'll just simply start it up and send you the link to continue, unless you have to go.
Well, then I should just send you the link.
Okay, you can do
And
that.
yeah,
Although I'll need to record it. So would it be
yeah.
easier for me
Well,
or?
I would send you the recording afterward.
Okay, okay, fine. So I'll let you know when we got about a minute left. Um,
It's on the screen.
yeah, okay, good. Glad to know. So, yeah, one of the things I see is that mediation itself is the problem. There's so many degrees of mediation now between us and the real, the thing, the material world.
At what point were we ever directly connected with the real? I mean, at
Well,
what
look at
point
it
did
this
we
way.
not have layers of
Herman
mediation?
Melville went and sailed on a ship. He saw whales. He went to tribes in the South Pacific. He eventually came back and wrote about those things. So he is 1 degree, if you don't count the ship and everything, 1 degree away from his actual experiences.
Mhm.
Later in the 1920s, and so you had people like Edgar Rice Burroughs or H. Rider Haggard writing books about things they hadn't ever experienced. Eventually, you have these pulp novels, and out of that comes serials that kids watch on Saturday afternoon.
Okay.
And those serials are based on adventures. But you can tell watching the serials. Now, King Kong was made by some people who actually had some experience, which is one of the reasons I think it works. But the serials are very hokey. They're made in Hollywood. You can tell the California scenery, and it's quite. It's already now very far removed from anyone who's had an actual experience.
Mhm.
Then Spielberg and Lucas come along in the 1980s and say, "Oh, we want to remake these. Let's make an adventure serial." Now, neither of these guys have had adventures either. And in fact, their main source seems to be the serials themselves. So now you've added another layer. At the same time, they were making, eventually you would have a video game of this sort of thing. You would have the Mummy movie with Brendan Fraser, which is them looking at Indiana Jones. Eventually, you have little games that people play, of find this. By that time, your experience with anything related to nature is so far mediated. And this is Jacques Ellul and Marshall McLuhan's point. Okay. There's so much mediation between you and the thing that whatever it is you're doing is too abstract. And my problem is this is what we've done to humanity now. So it's not just whales and ships, but we actually have difficulty understanding humanity, understanding history, understanding art, understanding movies made 15 years ago if you're like 20 right now. There's just, one of the things is when we entered that, as I talked about the noise zone, when we entered that, what comes after that, as I can see it, is we are no longer progressing forward. We haven't been for a while. We are now simply in the now. Wait a minute, I've got another, wait, now, hold on, now. Oh, another notice, now.
Okay, but what do you mean by progressing forward?
Well, the whole idea of modernism was there was this concept of evolution. And the evolution usually meant, and I don't see it this way, but it usually meant progress. Hmm. And you can see this line, going from the Renaissance all the way up to the early aughts, that there is this, the idea of progress. By the time Kurt Cobain sucked on the shotgun, no, he certainly didn't see it. And most of the people in that particular movement didn't. But nevertheless, the organs of propaganda and commerce and politics kept pushing the idea. But once we got the smartphones and once we got the social media, particularly those two things, we were suddenly in a zone where the paradigm was no longer about the future, just as in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was not about the future. The Middle Ages was about the past. They looked back at the things from the Roman era. They kept trying to remake them, but they never saw themselves as being in the golden age of any sort. They looked back at the classical world as being more of a golden age, and they were in the Middle Ages. That's why we call it the Middle Ages.
They weren't in the Middle Ages, though. They didn't say, we're in the Middle Ages.
No, but they had this idea that they were between things. They didn't see themselves as being, they didn't see themselves as progressing the way a modern person would, but nor did they see themselves as being the pinnacle of anything either. But they weren't in the now. They were more turned backwards. C.S. Lewis in his book, The Discarded Image, makes this really clear. And also Owen Barfield in his book, Saving the Appearances. Culturally, they were focused backwards at the things lost.
That doesn't track, because culturally they were explicitly facing God or eternity. Mm-hmm. They were in eternal nowness with God. So it was very stable because they weren't facing backward. They weren't facing backward.
Yeah, but they weren't facing forward.
But they were facing upward. They were facing God. They were facing the kingdom of heaven.
Points out that, for instance,
this just sounds like a modern interpretation.
No.
Sounds
in the Middle
Ages,
a person, for instance, Shakespeare, as we know, often wrote stories that weren't original. Boccaccio's Decameron is not original material. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is not original material. It's all based on each other. What it is they're looking at things that have happened. Shakespeare sees something in Denmark and goes, "Yeah, I'll turn this into Hamlet." He looks at Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, there's this strife there. That would make a good story. He takes based on things and turns it into something. But as C.S. Lewis points out, the idea of making something original, and if we look at Shakespeare, say, kind of a transitionary figure. But if we look at the medieval people, he says the idea of making something original, they would have thought, what are you talking about original? We haven't finished with these stories yet.
Yeah.
So they were always referring back, but they weren't trying to make something better. They were just, their mentality was to use things in such a way as to find more material out of it, to get more material out of it.
Mhm.
Because all these people.
Yeah, so I don't think that that's looking back. I think that's
No, you have
being
to
in
be
a
inspired
dialogue.
by the things from the past.
Well, yeah, but you're in dialogue with it.
I mean, they also went
Making it
into
now.
this dark, yeah, it's a dialogue for sure. But it isn't the same as the modern era when people started, when people started to focus as in this, I mean, they started thinking about a progressive evolution before Darwin. Keats makes this clear in his poetry. Other people do as well. I mean, the whole French Revolution was basically an idea of we shall better ourselves than those people. And there's a division within that period as we enter into the Enlightenment. There's a period of transition in there, lasts about 250 years. But I think that now we don't look forward to a future, but the average person who's grown up with the smartphone and the cell phone tends to look at this, what's happening now, what's cool now, what's on my device now. We're locked into a nowness, which is not an eternal looking at God or anything like this. Even if we could argue that, go back and argue that's what was happening in the Middle Ages. That's certainly not what's happening now. We've lost the transcendence of the 60s and that in-between period with the New Age movement and even the charismatic movement in Christian churches all had this aspect of transcendence about it, but now we're not there. This is what we've come out of. But no, I think we've entered a new zone. And like I said, we don't have a name for it yet because you can't figure that stuff out until later.
Well, yeah, but it does collapse upon current events. The current thing collapses all of this disparate nowness and meanness into a singular point of contention. Pandemic, George Floyd, BLM, Ukraine, whatever it is. So we all get to superimpose our properties or our profiles onto the current thing. And so, yeah, it is removed from nature and it is embedded in narrative, but within that is still plenty of property to generate ideas, stability, confidences.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what Jacques Ellul means by cracks of freedom.
Okay.
So that we can, as he says, install with kind of a trembling, a kind of a freedom to keep trying to make the thing for which humanity is searching within the cracks of freedom, knowing that they shift, they move. YouTube won't always be a crack of freedom any more than rock music remained so for that long. Things move and change. So, and I see this having a great effect on people's faith, particularly the age of transformation. Well, the modern age kind of made everything kind of like ground level. And then suddenly there's this new religious thrust. And I look at whether it's the hippies or the charismatic movement or any number of things, I think we moved out of the realm of logic. And, if someone in 1955 had said, you got to face reality, they would have known exactly what they meant. And what they meant was hard facts, daily life, going to work, raising a family, it would all been very imminent things. And at the same time, there was a hope that the society was moving forward on a larger level. But I think that all changed by the end of the 60s. Now, it changed in different places in different ways. So in in the Soviet Union, it probably didn't change till the late 80s. Because they were keeping it down. They were keeping the modernist and the age of transformation stuff out. They were keeping the hippie stuff out. They were trying to keep modern art out. They didn't fully succeed, but they certainly were trying. The Chinese are probably still in it today. And there was a moment where they opened up a bit, but it wasn't that much. And even then, they were really much more focused on the imminent, which meant building skyscrapers in Shanghai and factories and production and such. Things Americans don't really think much about anymore. We live in a different world. We don't live in that world. And I'm not saying our world is better or their world is better. It's just that they are still perhaps artificially being kept in that modernist world where everything was about, I think communism is definitely a modernist type of thing. And I think that my experience of Christianity was, see, I was not a Christian at all till the age of 15. I wasn't against Christianity. I had no thoughts about it whatsoever. And then I ran into these weird Christian hippies, and they were pointed in a very different direction. I did go, they didn't have any for a while, they didn't have any specific church you were supposed to go to. So they said on Sunday, go where you want. So I went to a few churches at that point, and it was like entering a morgue. It was just like, they didn't have the praise teams. They didn't have the up music. Everything was just down. And you weren't even supposed to come into a church if you were wearing jeans, or your hair was as long as mine is, or, all of those things. There was just this weird aspect to it. So I think that then what happened growing out of the 70s was this charismatic movement, and there were a lot of different aspects to it. And also at the same time was this commercial Christianity, which would eventually, all these things altogether would eventually invent things like the praise song, like Christian commercial music, or Christian contemporary, but I always call it commercial music because it's a very commercial thing. It's a market. I think churches were all really affected during this time. And this would have been the time you were growing up, since you're a bit younger than I am, obviously. This would have been the time you were going to church. And if I remember correctly, you went to some sort of Lutheran covenant kind of spin-off church, and your father was a pastor at the time. What was your church services like when you were young? What do you remember about them?
We changed churches quite a bit, and it wasn't until my teen years that we stumbled upon Swedish covenant songs. And
so your family was your father a pastor before then?
He wanted to be, but he didn't do that until my late teens. He went to seminary.
Right. Okay. Oh, in your teens. So that's quite a bit of water under the bridge. Yeah. So when you were like 6, 7, 8 years old, you were just kind of like, you'd go to different churches, that kind of thing?
We were involved in kind of a very tight church community that took on cult aspects with the laying on the hands and the demonology stuff. And then
right. Do you remember the name of those people?
Faith Fellowship in San Jose, I think. But we left when I was 5 or 6, and then went on a diaspora until my early teens.
Right. So it sounds like this was a charismatic church that you remember when you were younger. Like, did they sing in tongues and that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It sounds like the kind of church mine became as time passed on.
Mm-hmm.
And but then it sounds like because of the wandering of your father, you never stayed in. It sounds like later you were involved in this other church, but by this point, you'd probably seen something that did something to you, threw you off somehow. Or because I remember you talking about, you went through a period where you kind of really backed away from faith and all of that sort of stuff, right?
No.
Didn't you become an atheist at one point?
Me?
Yeah.
No.
No, okay, I missed that part of the story then.
No.
I was just wondering. But you did, but your ideas became more individual in a sense. Would that be fair to say?
I had direct spiritual experience as a child, and as a teen, I didn't see that in the church, and so I went in search of that. Once I
and when you say direct spiritual experience, what do you mean?
A connection with the divine energy.
How did that manifest?
Well, it's really hard to.
I mean, I've had dreams, for instance, that weirdly came true. I've been in places where I really felt something. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's not difficult to talk about these things. I mean, I can be very specific about what I was feeling when. maybe that's difficult for you, and I don't want to push that if it is. But
I would just be like a vibration or a warmth that's not material, that is closely analogous to the word love,
right.
but
Well, without talking about it, what did it make you feel more about? Like you were saying analogous to love, just feeling kind of surrounded, or did it make you feel? It sounds like it gave you an experience that you didn't see later in churches.
yeah, yeah.
And as I've heard you talk about this, and I have listened to you a few times before talking about it, and I was just curious about what was the difference, between what you evidently your experience as a child, which I take to be very real, it gave you some sort of thing. What was it in the churches that bothered you later?
I was always bothered by church because church is about power, and human power is different than divine power. So you have these churches that speak about divine power and that manifest human power, and those are two different things. And so the sum total, to summarize my childhood experiences of the divine, would be that I was connected with a power of just tremendously greater than anything that can be contained in this world, that's actually just kind of penetrating or flowing through this world. And then as I grew up, I would see either human beings use the language that was developed around the experience of spirituality, which we call religion, to organize themselves, to promote their own agendas, or to kind of strip it of any kind of actual charismatic, I guess is the term, meaning, and then just kind of hollow it out into this kind of social gesture that we go through in order to instill morality and sync up and have community, right? And so there's the cult direction for it, or which is just you use these documents and these religions in order to exert your power as the minister or whatever, the leader, over other people, and to orchestrate a tight cult-like synchronicity or syncing up of people's will, and then kind of like directing that will. Or you kind of water it down and water it down and water it down until it's just kind of this building where you go and you have snacks and you sing some songs and you have youth groups and families get together and find babysitters for each other and have clubs and stuff like that. And I, in my teens, saw both the problems with both of those things. I wanted to get to the root.
Did you experience both types?
Yeah. Yeah. So I grew up in the more cult-like, and I could see when a church...
Right, the one in San Jose, you were mentioning that one?
Yeah, yeah. And then in my tween years, we were at a church and they got a new pastor, and I knew right away, I could just tell right away that this guy would take the church in the direction of just a bad direction. He corrupt it somehow. So, so we ended up in a very nice church. The Community Covenant is just very nice, and it's just very friendly, very community oriented, and you believe things, and you believe in right and wrong in Jesus Christ and doing good works. And that just was unsatisfactory to me because I wanted that direct connection. I wasn't
satisfying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, to me, it seems there has to be some sort of relationship with a people. That is to say that I don't know if I've had tremendous individual experiences, but one thing I've come to understand is I remember once, 1993, I was, I don't know, 35 years old, 33 years old or so. And I just had this absolutely amazing experience where I suddenly saw all my memories I saw my past. I saw how I needed to rectify everything. And then I realized, oh, okay, well, this is really great. Unfortunately, tomorrow I'm going to meet somebody. Or I was going to start meeting people and they're not having this experience. And so I will be alone with it. And I will need to realize that's going to smack me in the face. And sure enough, it did. As soon as I got back I was visiting where I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and then moved back to New York City. And as soon as I got there, a couple of things happened that just they just took my breath away, But I also got something out of that, because whatever I had worked through, when I started to meet these kinds of things, which was in this case people who treated life as if time didn't matter. And I thought to myself, it's just like, why would, like, this one guy stole something from me and then tried to sell it back to me. And I was saying, now, why would a person do that? Did he not, and I'd helped this guy out before. It's a long story. And there was also a girl that I knew, and she had gone and had some sort of breast reduction surgery. And I had told her, please don't, because it's kind of a sign that you don't like yourself. And she said, no, that's not true. And then she killed herself, hung herself in a friend's bathroom with the curtain. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, these people, they live in a world where it's like the most important thing is what's happening now. They have no past. They don't know how to get to the future. And I said, why is that happening? And I realized it was because of time. But the thing that struck me about that is that time is all about relationships. That our relationship to God, for instance, I think there's a reason why the Bible basically says God is not located in a thing, in an image, because God is always revealed as the Word. So whether it's I am through Moses, or in the beginning was the Word and the Word was with God, or in the beginning God said, these kinds of things. Or the still small voice that reveals itself to Elijah, not the storm, not the wind and such. I think that the Word is all about relationship. And so for me, it's not good enough to have resolved my own issues, or no matter what spiritual experience I've had. If I can't then now talk to my neighbor, and believe me, I believe you are trying very hard to talk to your neighbor, particularly online. I really love what you're doing. You've gotten so much out of you. But I think that we have to, in a sense, I don't think we can have a private experience. We do. We obviously have private experiences. But if that's where they stay, something is lacking. Does this make any sense? I don't know if, it's, so I have a friend right now, lives here. He's an American, and he's going through some stuff. And I was recently talking to a girl he broke up with, and I just said to him, he has issues, but I'm committed to him. It's, for instance, I think that the time component in love is the most important, and the time component is commitment. Because there's all sorts of other components of emotion and the body and, sharing interests and all of these sorts of things, conversation. But it's being willing to say, I will be there no matter how long it takes. And that's the thing that's been largely lost. It's been lost in the churches as well. And so that I think that a lot of the act you see, and you really see the act in certain kinds of Protestant churches. I mean, I went to a Presbyterian church for 22 years in Alaska. It was a nice place, but it was kind of stuck being nice. And I tried, I really did. And I was just like, okay. So, but I was still committed to them as long as I was there. It was just like, but okay, if I can't get through anything in the organizational structure, if I can't get through anything in teaching, which I did do some teaching there, then at least let me be committed to the people here, because that's part of it. And that made it worthwhile, even if it was really substandard in many ways. So, but I think that, well, it sounds like you had the kind of like really intense private experience. personal can be used in two different ways. One is full of character and individuality, and the other is private. And you had kind of both personal and private experience, which is very obviously it's hard for you to really explain, which makes sense to me, because that happens. I've certainly got those kinds of experiences, although they're unique to me. But I think that it also had the effect of kind of putting you, maybe, do you ever get the feeling you're just like alone in the sense that, I mean, how are your relationships with people and such? Or how do you express your belief, your faith in regards to other people?
Well, you'd have to ask what's belief or faith. What are those things, and why are those?
Trust is always based on knowledge, and knowledge takes time. So that for instance, if someone comes up to me and says, trust me, well, that's the first person I'm not going to trust. Why? You've given me no reason to. So, for instance, why did I want to get in touch with you? Because I've watched enough of you over time, and Lord knows it takes a lot of time to watch. I haven't watched all your videos, but I've watched enough to know that,
that's my firewall.
Yeah, exactly. It's, but it's the kind of thing that I say, okay, well, I know Benjamin is, I look at you as being basically an honest person to the degree that I trust you. I don't claim to know you. Whatever I see is just, this is Benjamin presenting himself, and this is what I see. I don't agree with everything you always say. That's fine. Because to me, that's part of the good thing of where we are now. We can have, I think, fuller discussions and I think what the Bridges of Meaning Festival in Germany was about was getting it offline and bringing it down into the world. And in regards to, we did that, I think it was great. And Paul has a lot of interesting experiences. He went on through England and had more of these meetings. But I think that for instance, I trust you because of the time I've spent absorb's the wrong word, visiting Benjamin Boyce's presentation of the things that he is interested in, which includes whatever I get of your life, which obviously isn't a perfect representation by any means. But it also includes the things you refer to. As I'm talking to you occasionally, I'll remind it, oh yeah, he's really interested in literature and things like this, and writing and words and such. And I'll remember that. And so I'll be like, oh, try to be on my best behavior in a sense, because I just know a bit about, you presented yourself well enough that I know, okay. But I think whenever you meet anyone like if someone comes to my door, and I had a couple of people I didn't know come over this week, particularly there was a girl who came over with her boyfriend. Her I'd talked to, him I'd never talked to. So he starts to me, I don't know anything. I don't distrust him. I don't trust him. Because I don't know where to trust him. Is he good for a conversation? Is he good? Should I ask him to borrow money? Probably not. You never want to make that an opening salvo. It's because you don't know someone. And I think trust, it takes a while. Trust for me, it's like, there are different zones in a person's life. So, like I said, there's money. How do they argue? How do they get angry? One of the things I've noticed over you, I'm sure you do get angry, but I've never really seen you angry in a conversation. I've seen you talk to some pretty prickly people. So, it's like, but you go ahead and, and I say, Benjamin Boyce is pretty good from what I can tell through the medium at conversation, so I trust you more on that level. I don't know anything about you and money. I can guess that you're probably okay with it, but I don't know anything. I wouldn't want to, I certainly wouldn't want to ask you for money, nor would I want to. And the worst thing is when you don't know someone, and some people really get crazy about money and, in all sorts of ways. So it's kind of like they might be great up here and not so great here. But to me, trust and faith are totally related. So my faith in God is based on time. So that when I became a Christian at the age of 15, I literally, for me, the world was a very dark place. And I didn't see a lot of light just due to the way I grew up. I had a mother who had got married 3 times by the time I was 7. And the third husband, she had decided she wanted to find someone she could help. So she decided to look lower than herself. And she found a really nice alcoholic man. But at the same time, I felt there is some goodness in people. And I could see it. There was like a 93-year-old woman, like 1968. How far back does that take her? Who would always just talk to me. And I really thought that was interesting. She was a nice old woman. Was she perfect? No. I brought over a couple after I became a Christian. She was always pushing me to become a Christian. And eventually I did. But I brought over a couple. It was a kind of a white girl and a guy his father was black. So he was mixed. And as soon as they left, the next time I saw her, she says, was he black? And she'd grown up in the South. So I learned, okay, when it comes to these kinds of things, I'm not going to trust her that much. That doesn't mean I would negate the rest of who she was, because she wasn't like a savage racist or anything, but she grew up with the prejudices of her times, which are, I would say, more egregious than whatever the prejudices of our times are that we're being accused of. That is to say, what is supposedly racism now versus growing up in the South in the 1800s, 1870s, 1860s, that she grew up during that period. So, yeah, I'm sure. But I've learned that when I became a Christian, suddenly the world had meaning. Prior to that, it had none. And, the only thing I could find at that point was rock music, which then I felt betrayed by as a kid because it then started to become commercial. I could feel it change around the year 1970. And I could feel like the radio had changed. And I felt like, why is this happening? It was so good. I mean, it was 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. But the same thing was, I just didn't see much that held things together. And at the same time, I wanted to believe. I think there's always this tension in everyone of, the disappointments versus the hopes. But in that moment of starting to understand and believe things, my life changed completely. And it was that I saw that, there is a meaning to stuff that includes the darkness. And that's what I got from Christianity. Why did Christ die on the cross? It wasn't because we were so cool. So, once I internalized that, then it made sense. But also at different points in my life, I would do things based on, it was like the trust grows for me in faith. So I'm living in Georgia right now. Why am I living in Georgia? I can tell you truthfully, I wouldn't be here if I didn't feel God wanted me to be here. But how can I explain to anyone exactly why I know that? Well, the only thing I can say to you is that's how I ended up in Alaska. That's how I ended up in New York. And that's also how I ended up in Switzerland at this place, and I would often step out into zones, like it happens. I mean, I've almost gotten to the point where I realized the more I step into a zone of faith, which is always based on knowledge, that is to say, the knowledge just as trust. I trust someone based on how much I know them. I don't know what's beyond what I initially trust. And that's what faith is. Faith is the evidence of things not seen. But it's not the random evidence of things. It's not blind faith. I didn't get in touch with you as an act of blind faith, like, there's this guy, Benjamin, and I want to talk to him. No, I got in touch with you because I said, I think I might be able to have an interesting conversation. We'll see, And so I built it on that. And my hope with every person I meet, every place I go, is that I get a little better that I know something a little bit more, that I can then trust the person for more. I can trust the situation more. And one of the things I've seen in my life is that, in modernist science, the ultimate reality was stuff, the atoms, the DNA, the things. But in fact, if we start applying ideas like chaos theory or information theory and all these things, then you start to realize, the ultimate of what makes up everything isn't the stuff. It's the stuff going on within it. That is to say, people nowadays will say things like, I'm just atoms, I'm just the same as this table. I'm like, no, you're not. You're a collection of relationships of atoms. And that's a very different thing. Your collection of relationships of cells, your collection of relationships, your DNA is a code. But how did that code get there? It's a relationship. Everything in life is really, I don't want to sound particularly new agey at all, but it is a relationship in the sense that everything, it's like in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But that word is logos, but that word also implies relationship. Because there's no such thing. I mean, this is why the Trinity is such a fascinating idea to me. It's because it implies eternal relationship. Now, I'm not seeing three figures spinning around in space or something. We don't understand what that really means, but I think it's a good illustration that relationship is foundational from every perspective. So that to me, then evil would be the opposite of that. Evil would break relationships. Now, sometimes there are human relationships that have to be broken, but why are they having to be broken? Just because there's evil going on. Something is already there. It's just like, I'm sorry, Germany, we don't really like what you're doing in 1941 or 42. So we're going to have a big problem here. But that's because something's already was a problem. But the way I look at it is, you're walking down the street in any big city, and I ask this question of myself: what can I do to hurt someone here within a very short period of time? Do something to someone bad that they will remember the rest of their lives. And the answer is almost unlimited. I can go up and swear at them. I can talk about the shape of their nose and laugh at it. I can push them into the street. I can kick them. I can just endless amounts of things that I can do, push them in front of a car or something. Whereas if I reverse it and I say, how many good things can I do if I'm walking down that same big, busy street? And someone might say, well, you give that person money. It says, yeah, but you don't know what that person's going to do with it. And I think you could also, you could stop someone from being run over by a car. That would be nice. But then again, that already kind of implied something evil was going on. And in fact, the only way you could do anything good for anybody, you couldn't even go up to someone and say, hi, I'm Byrne, I'd like to be your friend. They look at you like, come on, what do you really want? But it's by taking time to form a relationship, to know something about that person. And so that trust is formed. So to me, trust and faith are the foundation of absolutely everything. And it's so in the physical world, it's so in energy, it's so in matter, it's so in whatever spirit really is, So I never have a problem with the existence of God. I have a problem with our existence. What are we doing to ourselves? Why do we live in propaganda bubbles? Things like that.
Mm-hmm. So what is the core of your work then, online specifically? What's your channel about?
Basically, I'm looking through history at things, but trying to raise questions about the nature of where we are now, but with a historical, cultural focus. So I can talk theological things, but I generally don't. I talk more about, sometimes I'll wander into philosophy, occasionally the news of the day, but I try to stay away from too many current events, although I keep up with them. And the reason for that is because it's so easy for all of that to turn into propaganda. And propaganda is one of the things I most hate. And I hate it because of what
But you
it does.
create it.
Huh?
Don't you create it? I mean, you're on Twitter,
I try
you're
not
on
to.
YouTube. I mean,
I try not
how
to.
can you not be creating propaganda
That is
just
that
with
is
your
the
just your
that is
spin,
the question, isn't it?
right?
Because I understand exactly what you're saying.
I mean, don't you? If any effective piece of communication that's not between one
No,
person and
I
another
would
person's
disagree.
propaganda. Yeah.
Although I think you're close, but I would disagree because I think that, for instance, if two people are talking and they disagree and they have an argument, are they propagandizing each other? I don't think so. I just think they see things differently and they're discussing. Now, as soon as they bring in what other people think that was probably formulated by the media, now propaganda is involved because propaganda isn't conversation, but propaganda is, again, it's the mediation. Jacques Ellul says in his book on propaganda, he says that everything through the mass media is propaganda. It has to, just by its nature.
Well, but so does any effective YouTube channel is indistinguishable from propaganda.
Many of them
I
are.
mean,
I would say you do a remarkably good job of not being a propagandist. And here's why I think that. Here's why I think that is because you allow for difference of opinion. You allow for the dialogue. A real propagandist can't, which is why I wonder, the more professional people get, the more I sense the propaganda. Now, this has always been one of my fears about Jordan Peterson, and he rides this line where sometimes he's acting like a propagandist, and sometimes I feel that he's just being a human being talking. It's easy to fall into the propaganda mode. The propaganda mode always takes an us and them. It has to. It always has. It has to rely on certain kinds of myths that are within the society, which I do not do at all. For instance, the reason my channel doesn't grow is because I really don't care about professional. And I know that professional is what would be the curse of the kiss of death for me and would make me a propagandist if I tried too hard to make it slick. So what I try to do instead is to make it human to the degree I can, given the fact that I'm very aware I'm looking through a screen and I'm dealing with screens, and that's not optimal. But my hope is to get people to interact with each other again in the real world, because I think that many of our problems won't change until in the real world people can have those kind of inhuman face-to-face.
So you're trying to use your media to propagate your values into people's lives.
Propagate is different than propaganda. As C.S. Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, propagation is like a bird feeding its young, basically training the bird to be a bird. Propaganda is like the poultry keeper raising the hens for a purpose the hens know nothing about. And so to me, propaganda involves, this is why I find people who are on the left, of course, who get upset with me, but I also find people on the right, because they are in this box. And I think the people that I find myself most connected to, either watching or the closer they get to some sort of, the phrase radical center has been used. That is the idea that there should be a town square or a town hall, a town meeting, that we should be able to talk to each other. I think this means is good. This means is just not complete. So I think that, like I said, it's the crack of freedom. Right now, this is a way we can talk and get ideas across. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a lousy way to, for instance, try to, like, I know Christians who would try to use this they always have to say the same phrases and the same words. It's just like, Christ died for your sins. And I'm sitting there going like, oh yeah, I believe that. But what you're doing is you're taking the word, the word that should be life to us, and you're turning it into a visual sign. You're flattening it. And once you do that, I have a whole thing on texture that I talk about. And I'm really, more and more as I go, I keep thinking about the loss of materiality and how that's affecting us. And I think it's behind things like pollution. It's behind things like just how we even meet with each other. The presentation of a person on Instagram is all about presenting a kind of a shiny, flat facade of a person. Whereas the real person, if you spend 5 minutes with a real person, provided they're not, their own personal presentation isn't super slick, you would immediately see through it. And that's why physical presence, embodiment, incarnation is so important. Because more and more I'm seeing there's a Gnostic touch to what goes on here, and I don't want to encourage that at all. So in everything I do, it's like, maybe it's time to get away from this. You don't have to quit. You don't get radical, but you have to spend more time with the real world, spend more time with your family, spend more time in nature, spend more time with animals, even cats.
Is there grass in Georgia, or is it just rocks and AK-47s?
AK-47s. Evidently, your image of Georgia is obviously one.
There's a bunch of wells with a bunch of Jews in it. Or is that Kazakhstan? I don't know exactly.
I think you're thinking Kazakhstan, whatever. Yeah, maybe you watched Borat. But
no, I don't.
I have to write a really fine line between, this shelf back here is full of books and music and movies, and this isn't my library. My real library is in Alaska, and I'm trying to bring it here. It would take my whole place, which includes 2 more rooms you don't see that are quite big.
Yeah.
But I realize the books and everything are just, if all the art is collection on a wall, they're junk. They have to feed back into relationships. It has to be, okay, this is what I've seen in this book. Does this mean anything to you? That's what good art does, I think. I would never know what it was like to float down the Mississippi River on a raft if I didn't read Huckleberry Finn. It's just like good art takes you someplace. It opens up something you didn't know. It's part of the communication. It's part of the relationship. That's, to me, why all forms of art are so important. I've been reading a lot about statues recently and just seeing like, wow, there's a lot. I'd never really thought about statues before. But I'm getting ready to do a series of 4 videos called The Cute and the Creepy. And more I've been trying to understand, why is it we're now surrounded by cute, big-eyed things and nobody 100 years ago was? What does this mean? And so I've done a lot of spelunking to understand that. And I think I've got some answers, but that would take us too far away. But for instance, Georgia, 2 mountain ranges, the Greater Caucasus and the Lesser Caucasus. The Greater Caucasus basically cut us off from Russia. Right now, if you go on and just type in Georgia into YouTube, you'll find all sorts of Russians stuck at that border trying to get in, because the Georgians will let them in, although that's creating a lot of intensity down here. So it's a very fascinating place. We might be subject to the old Chinese curse of things being interesting.
And what's to the west?
And that's the north. To the south is Armenia. To the west is Turkey. To the east is Azerbaijan, and then Iran. Things are happening there too. I feel like I'm like sitting in some sort of place. It's like I didn't come here for the excitement, but I'm getting it.
Oh yeah! Wow.
But the nice thing is I live next to a big park. If I start walking into the hill, what I did a couple of weeks ago is I spent 1 lari on a bus trip, which took me about 15 kilometers away. I spent 1 lari. That's 35 cents. And I went and spent 3 nights in this little village at an Airbnb for like $25 a night. I explored the place. I'm making a video of it for my Georgian channel. And then I walked all the way downhill from 4,600 feet down to here, which is, I guess, around 1,000 feet or so, 1,500 feet. So it was this long 5-hour walk down the mountain. And that's what the mountains are like. So the great thing for me here is I realized, right behind me, I can walk to Armenia if I want. I mean, would take days, but I like having this backyard. When I lived in Alaska, we always had. I loved the nature there, and that was serious nature. It wasn't a zoo.
Wow.
And so, but yeah, and I'm glad I'm here. It's a long story how I got here, but it involves puppets. But because that's another thing I study as puppets, I see as the antidote to too much digital media as far as an art form. And I like dancing as well. I have friends here who are ballerinas and such. But yeah, no, I'm trying to, I spent so much of the later part of the 20th century trying to understand what was happening. But actually, it was like in the late 80s. It was in the mid 90s when I suddenly said, okay, I see it now. And now I'm going to Alaska because I just realized it no longer matters being in New York City because this is just going to become a big shopping mall. People are going to come here. No, people in the mid 1990s weren't coming to New York anymore to be something. I mean, some people were, but most of the young people were there just because it's so cool. And I'm kind of like, when I first arrived in the 80s, it's like everyone's coming there to be a dancer or an artist or a punk rocker or, something. And now it's just like, it's cool. I'm like, I don't want to be around cool people. So I decided to go to Alaska and learn some other things.
Be around cool bears.
Some very cool bears. I used to take people on tours to see some very large cool bears.
Byrne, I have to get ready.
It is time to go.
I got to bounce, but I got to bounce.
Yes. So, well, I've enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, it's great to meet you.
Yeah. And I hope to talk to you again sometime. And so, have a good day. I will have a good night. And,
enjoy your evening.
Nice talking to you.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it. I hope to talk to you again. And more importantly, I hope someday to meet you in the flesh, but who knows when that'll happen.
It's a big world and it's a small world. So.
It is. Okay. Take care.
Bro. Have a good day.
Okay, well, I hope you found that fascinating, and I certainly did. Eventually, I did get him to talk about his kind of spiritual upbringing, Christian upbringing, and there were times, but then again, he would always go back into it's an interesting mode. I find it fascinating talking to him. And if you want more, there are plenty of other dialogues on this channel, and there are, of course, many other videos on larger subjects. Watch that little video that says, what you should watch next, the Anadromous Guide. And by the way, if you don't know what in the world anadromous is, it is a word used in biology to describe fish swimming back upstream to spawn. So you should do that. You should swim against the stream.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.